I'd like to welcome you to the last full day of the Conference of Tlingit Tribes and Clans. We are sharing our knowledge. This year's theme was unique, and it drew an awful lot of thought for the organizing committee on how we're going to put this together, being the 150th year, and how we were going to weave in our history. We are healing ourselves. And I'm really thankful that we have such a breadth of skilled, knowledgeable people on the organizing committee that we're able to put their resources together and their thoughts, their skills, and expand the presentations to include some real Russian people. Because we have some real Tlingit people too. Put them together and we'll see what we got. Well, I think that this healing ourselves is a critical component to have Russians here, and I'm really thankful that Peter Metcalf had the skills and resources to pull together this campus. So Peter has some introductions to do, but please welcome Peter Metcalf.
Thank you, Jerry. I'm going to introduce the video here in a few moments, but first I'd like to introduce my friend Sam Skaggs, who's the president of the Sitka Fine Arts Camp Board. And Sam and I have known each other probably for, I don't know, 30 years or so, but he was just giving me a little bit of his background. And one thing I definitely did not know about Sam is he used to be a muskox rancher. That's when he first came to Alaska about 40-some years ago. Sam?
Thank you, Peter. Yes, when I first came to Alaska, I worked for the Muskox Development Corporation out of Fairbanks and wrangled muskox and 160 of them before we moved them out to Unalakleet as part of the whole muskox producers co-op using Kivya for creating a cottage industry for Inupiaq, mostly knitters. But I'm here just to be very brief as just the current president of Sitka Fine Arts Camp. We are just so honored to have you all here, that the organizers, Jerry, Alice, Peter, and others chose the campus to come back to for this conference and sharing your knowledge, our knowledge. And we're humbled and honored to have you here because, as you know, 6 years ago, barely, we were handed this campus with every roof leaking, this room right here full of empty desks and birds flying through it, and everything boarded up that had been sitting here for 4 years. And so what has happened since then has just been an absolute, probably the largest volunteer project in the history of our state, if not to the Northwest, with over 50, 60s. We've stopped counting at 60,000 volunteer hours from people in this community of Sitka and people that love this campus and want to see something go forward. So our board is just, again, we thank you for being here. We're the current stewards of this place. We know that we don't know the full history of this place because we've only been on here for 40 plus years, because Sitka Fine Arts Camp was started in 1973 by some faculty of Sheldon Jackson College. So there's a short history there, but there's a very long history, and there's a long history before this place was even a campus. So on that note, one of the things that we've been struggling with as an organization is how can we provide space, a crucible, whatever, to have the story told here. And we're making little steps. Now that we've almost got every roof done, Sweetland is the next roof. We just found out the other day that's the largest shingle roof in Sitka. So we appreciate you being over there in a bit of a construction zone. We hope the heat's warm enough now We thank, and that's the only one I wanted to thank. I want to thank Bill and Nate and Roger Schmidt, our director of 17 years over here, Mary Bowes, our entire staff for trying to keep this conference going well for you all, and we hope it is. But yes, yeah, they're doing their best. So, thank you for that. But getting back to some ideas, so Mary Goddard and a few others, we've created, are going to be helping to create a alumni room. Mary Goddard did helped spearhead the art exhibit that's in the hallway of this, as you go between upstairs and here, and bringing in Alaska Native artists for that. The alumni room, our concept will be a multimedia room. There'll be history through photographs, through, we're hoping to have headphones with tapes of people telling stories of the history of this place. And we're thinking of like a phone booth where you could walk into the phone booth and share a story that you have about your experiences here or knowledge that you have. So it'd be a place to provide history, but to gather history at the same time. So stay tuned for that. We're working on that. Rebecca Paulson just received the grants to start doing some signage, some interpretive signage and historical interpretive signage for the campus. So we're moving. She's going to be talking about that later, I think. Anyway, I just want to let you know that we're trying to gather knowledge in the history and honor the history that we know is here and we want to be shared with everybody. So that's our commitment. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Sam. Sam is also the lead in the Skaggs Family Foundation, which contributed to this video we're about to show. That and the Rasmussen Foundation made it possible for me to produce this video, and the purpose of it was to, well, the concept really was to do essentially a movie trailer for a non-existent movie. And several people have called me after seeing this and asked where they can find the movie, so we succeeded. The idea was not to present a mini documentary, but to provoke interest in the sesquicentennial. And this came out of a contract I had with the Lieutenant Governor's office last year, in which I was asked to help coordinate these sesquicentennial events. And kind of the underlying purpose was to address some concerns of Alaska Natives in the previous celebratory nature of, for instance, the centennial. Many of you were alive then in 1967. You remember it was called the Purchase Centennial. And there was little recognition or no recognition at all of Alaska Natives and what their point of view might be on it. And almost universally, my Alaska Native friends hold to the position that they didn't sell it, certainly not in 1867, and it took over 100 years to resolve that issue, and to the degree it was resolved in ANCSA in 1971. But without further ado, I'd like to present this. It was produced by Channel Films. I worked with Howdis Brown, who's a young, very talented video producer, and he happens to be part Inupiat, so it was really fun working with Howdy, as he called, because for one thing, he called up and I say caller ID, and you get to say howdy, and be both a greeting and his name. Okay, so without further ado,
we always want history to be simple. It's not. It's always more complicated than we give it credit for.
Seward was the right person at the right time in the right place.
He imagined an American economic world empire.
And he thought that the U.S. interest in the Pacific was going to be the future of the nation. Just gotten out of the Civil War. We were going through Reconstruction, which was difficult. President Johnson was not popular. There's a very good possibility that if he was not Secretary of State, the Treaty of Cession probably wouldn't have happened.
we may be looked at as a bridge connecting the East and the West.
The United States had a question: what are we actually purchasing?
We were considered savages. We were considered uncivilized. We were considered as tools to implement the trade.
If we wanted to compare it to the oil industry of today, fur trading was every bit as big.
The Russians never intended to establish a growing, permanent colonial settlement. Sovereignty is not necessarily permanent.
They realized that they were losing their grip. There was no way they could keep people out.
Remote coast of North America could get your country into a war.
They wanted access to the furs, they wanted access to the trade, and how could they get it, and how could the U.S. government assist them in getting that access?
The bigger influence that the United States had on the Pacific was going to be to our advantage.
And nobody said, we're selling your tribal land. But we're still going to be here. And we're going to care for it.
That may not be important to the rest of the world, but it's important to Alaska Natives.
We don't know each other's culture. We don't know each other's language.
There wasn't any clean break.
Past is a foreign country. They do things differently there.
All right, well, thank you, and thank you to Samscape for helping to fund this project. And please be aware that tomorrow afternoon at 1:30, we're having a panel discussion, Treaty of Cession, Causes and Consequences. The fellows on this stage for Russian scholars will be part of that, as well as Jacqueline Estes, Aaron Legat, a Athabascan who's curator of the Anchorage Museum will be here, and our own David Russell Jensen will be discussing the consequences of the Treaty of Cession. So thank you very much.
What's the location? Location.
Oh, location, I'm sorry. Mount Edgecombe High School, the Activity Center. Thank you very much.
Since we're starting at 9, what time should we end this session so I can kind of plan and keep my panelists, in line?
Let me get Jerry on that one. All right.
What does the boss say?
You have all day.
No, I'm serious. There's lunch.
It says 10:45.
10:45. Okay.
We have lots of questions.
All right, we'll try to be 15. Okay. Maybe more like 15. I'm very happy to be. I'm Sergey Khan. Most of you know me. I'm delighted to be here, myself and my 3 colleagues, presenting this panel on what I call Russians and the Tlingit people, conflicts, contexts, and legacies. And what I wanted to, when I looked at what my colleagues wanted to talk about and what I wanted to discuss, they're just certain issues. We don't have big answers, and I think some of the bigger issues will be addressed tomorrow in the panel with our Native Alaskan colleagues. But what I want to talk about, and the other papers, I think, are more specific issues related to Russia's views of Alaska, Russian views of Native Alaskans, and that's the papers by Ilya Vinkovetsky, Andrei Znamensky, but papers by my own and Andrei Grinyov, looking more at specific relations between real people. These are not papers about the grand issues of colonialism and acquisition of land, the big, serious, grand issues that this film addresses, which are very important. But they address questions of how people on the ground in Alaska, Russians, Native people, and then eventually people of mixed descent, the Creoles, how they sometimes fought, but also traded, married each other, had families, had children. That's the legacy of Russian America that is still with us. How many, we know that many Native people have Russian ancestry. Many of them are proud of it, some of them are not, some of them don't want to talk about it, but many do. And it's that legacy that is human. It's the human story that some of us are interested in. I spent most of my academic life looking at Tlingit history and culture. Many of you know my work on the Russian church in the Tlingit, on Tlingit Ku'e, on the work of Vincent Sobolev, photographer, and the last work that just came out in 2015 based on a clan conference, sharing our knowledge. But now I'm interested in Sitka's population that was neither American nor purely Tlingit. It's that in-between community of people of mixed origin, many of them Alutiiq Russian, Aleut Russian, and some Tlingit Russian. And they lived here after 1867. That's what I'm interested in. Andrei Grinyov will talk about Russian Tlingit marriages and other close, intimate relations before 1867. I'm going to talk about interpreters who connected the two communities before, but also after 1867. So it's those human stories that we cannot ignore. I also want to say that when Jerry talked about real Russians, what really connects the four of us is that we speak Russian and we were born in the former Soviet Union. But our own biographies are very different. They're also, as most Russians, and I think many Alaskans, native and non-native, there's no such thing as a pure Russian. In fact, in this group is a person who's primarily Jewish, myself, with a little bit of Ukrainian and Polish thrown in. Ilya, I believe, is half Russian, half Jewish. Andrei Grinyov is Russian from his mother's side and Volga German from his father's side. And Andrei Znamensky is Russian, but also some Jewish and Bulgarian. So when Russian nationalists talk about pure Russian blood, it's mostly fiction. So we have, even among this group, there is this blending of different peoples and ethnicities. It's something to think about when we talk about pure blood, you know. Our biographies are very different, so I want to tell you just a little bit about us. The only one of the four who lives in Russia, works in Russia, and actually in very difficult times, when President Putin is really making life difficult for most Russian people. He's a professor at the St. Petersburg Polytechnic University and teaches a variety of courses in history, political science, sociology. He has 2 PhDs. In Europe, often people have PhD 1 and PhD 2. The first one was in anthropology or ethnology and dealt with Tlingit history and culture, and then more recently has a PhD 2 based on a monumental work on the history of Russian America. He's written probably 100, maybe more articles on Russian America, and I truly consider him the #1 scholar of Russian America, particularly objective, honest scholar who does not whitewash the colonial aspects of Russian presence in Alaska. He's not a Russian nationalist, like unfortunately some Russian historians are today, and they're trying to portray Russian Alaska like this sort of paradise. Many of his articles have been translated and published in English, so you can read them. And his books are The Tlingit Indians in Russian America, 1741-1867, published in Russian in the early 90s and in English in 2005. Some of you have seen it. And very recently he published this monumental book called Under the Wings of the Double-Headed Eagle. That's his history, and it's not just facts, and facts are based on his extensive, very deep research in the Russian archives in St. Petersburg. That's where he lives, and that's where most of the pre-revolutionary archives are. This book will be translated. In fact, it's already translated. It will be published by University of Nebraska Press in 3 installments because it's so large, and I'm involved in helping facilitate that. So wait for the book. Maybe there'll be a movie. Professor Pinkovetsky is a professor of history at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia. Born in Russia, he came to this country with his family at age 10, and his PhD is in history from UC Berkeley. And he published a very important book, which I don't remember the date when it first came out. He can say that himself. But recently came out in paperback, and it's a major work on the history of Russian America. It's called Russian America, an overseas colony of a continental empire, 1804-1867. And he looks at that history from a very different perspective from many of his predecessors, emphasizing the round-the-world voyages by Russian Navy. And he says that his thesis is that these voyages conducted from the Baltic Sea changed the way the Russians in St. Petersburg saw their own empire, and specifically the way they viewed Alaskan Native peoples. And so he's going to talk about that, but specifically how they viewed the Tlingit people. And then Professor Andrei Znamensky, born in Samara, right? Russia, in the heart of Russia. And again, he received his first PhD from St. Petersburg Pedagogical University in Russia, but then moved to the United States in '91, so this is already towards the tail end, or maybe even right after Soviet Union collapsed, and got his second PhD in the United States in '97. And his earliest work, based on his dissertation, was about Athabaskan people, the Dena'ina people, and Russian missionaries. He also did various other things, and his interests are very broad, so Alaska is only one of the topics. He also published documents on Russian missionaries and their travels through Athabaskan part of Alaska. He's very interested also in Russian nationalism, which was very strong in the late 19th century and is unfortunately raising its ugly head again. And currently, Alaska, in the imagination of these nationalists, is pretty central because there is this nostalgia among some politicians and ordinary people about, why did we get rid of Alaska? It should be ours. And talk of maybe we didn't sell it, maybe we just leased it to America. And so we can laugh about it, but some people, especially, there is this literature that's semi-scholarly, but more kind of pulp fiction also, that talks about it's ours. And he'll talk about that. It's an interest, it's unfortunately that literature exists, and he kind of monitors that. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Grignov. He asked me to read his paper because he feels his English is not up to snuff to read himself, but he wants to say a few words about his work, about his paper.
My name is
the history and technology of Russian America over 3 decades. On this topic, I published more than 120 works, including monographs and multi-titles of articles. Today, I am glad to present my paper on following theme: marriage and other forms of intimate relations between the Tlingit and members of other ethnic groups. Up until now, this theme has not been studied in detail. In this short presentation, I can touch only on the most significant issues. Because my English is not very good, I'm very sorry. I would like to ask my American friend and excellent specialist, Professor Sergei Khan, to read my paper for you, not just for your attention. Sergei, please.
I did mention one other work by Andrei, which is extremely important, extremely helpful. It's monumental. He likes to write long books, but I'm really hoping it be translated. He calls it Who is Who in Russian America, and it's a compendium of names of Russian.
We're going to expand that. You want to see it on the screen better?
Oh,
You get there.
this is actually with my corrections, so I don't know if you want me to. I prefer if you look at me rather than read it. My students do that, and I really also they don't have to. Yeah, this is Sergei Khan editing Andrei's paper at the 11th hour. Anyway, Andrei, who's very methodically combed through all the Russian archives, and he pulled out names of Russian, Creole, Alutiiq, Aleut, Unangan, Tlingit people mentioned in all the records. And it's an incredibly useful document. Like for me, for example, when I'm looking at Creole people who lived here after the transfer or cession, and I can go back, I want to know when were they born. If they were born before 1867, I can go to Andrei's Who's Who, find out who they were, who their father was. Sometimes even their native names. I can trace them maybe back to Russia, who was their great, like name Panamarkov. Now I know who their great-grandfather was. And Panamarkovs, they're people in this community who are descended from them, and so on and so forth. So it's an incredibly useful book, and I thank Andrei for that profusely. So he's interested in this paper, relations between Russian men and Tlingit women, marriages consecrated by the church, but also common law marriages. Sometimes they were temporary, but no matter what they were, they produced, again, offspring, and also, he argues, facilitated kind of cultural exchange, maybe Tlingit acquiring certain ideas from the Russians and so forth. The theme of interethnic marriages and relationships in the native population of Russian colonies, and also he's looking at other marriages of Tlingit and other peoples, has been repeatedly raised in the works of specialists in connection with the formation of a rather substantial ethnically mixed population. In Russian America, people of mixed origin were designated by the Spanish term Creole. Up to now, most investigations have been focused on either the Creoles without regard to their ethnic origin, or the most numerous subgroup which was formed on the Kodiak Island and its vicinity, where in 1784 the first permanent Russian settlement in Alaska, in America, was founded. At the same time, much less attention has been given to specific Creole group which emerged as a result of relationships and marriages of representatives of the most numerous Indian ethnos in Alaska, the Tlingit Indians, and the immigrants from Europe and Siberia. In 18th through the mid-19th century. It is likely that the first interethnic ties and marriages between Tlingit people and Russians took place already at the time of the discovery of Southeast Alaska by the Russians. In July 1741, when Captain Chirikov's packet boat came to the western islands of the Alexander Archipelago, and 2 boats with 15 sailors were sent ashore. None of them returned to the ship, and their fate is still one of Alaska's mysteries. Most scholars suggest that the so-called Chirikov men were lost at the hands of hostile native people. More convincing, in Andrei's view, is the version of the fate of the Chirikov men that we find in Tlingit stories and legends, and told to us by tribal elder, scholar, and I would add from my own side, my dear friend and adopted older brother, Mark Jacobs, Jr. According to this verse, the Russian sailors were not killed, but deserted and remained among the Tlingit. The fugitives were received amicably by the local Tlingit and married Indian women. However, subsequently, those deserters, having put their families in a canoe, went south because they feared that sooner or later the Russian ship would arrive again and they would be punished for desertion. Their descendants became the heads of the most eminent families in the village of Plawak, that's the story goes, or on Prince of Wales Island. It is possible that they or their descendants resettled even further south on the Queen Charlotte Islands, or Haida, settling among the Haidas. The Spanish, being the first Europeans to visit there in 1774, saw among native people small metal items, a piece of Russian bayonet, a knife made from the blade of the sword. The Spanish captain supposed that these were traces of the arrival of the Chirikov men. In addition, some of the Indians who came to meet the Spanish allegedly had blue eyes, not typical of the native people of that area. Over the next 55 years, the Russians... The Russians gradually colonized the Aleutian Islands, South and Southeast Alaska, and founded their settlements in new territories. The first such settlement was established in the Tlingit lands in Yakutat Bay in 1796, and then another fortified settlement in Sitka in the summer of 1799. By that time, the monopoly of the Russian-American Company had been established. The Tsar's government subordinated all its possessions in the New World to this organization. Because most of the population of the Russian settlements consisted of young men, this led to the establishment of intimate relations and marriages with local women, Tlingit women. But unfortunately, these liaisons were not always voluntary, and sometimes there was violence, force, and of course we know that this was the reason for the capture and destruction by the Tlingit of the Russian fortress here in Sitka in 1802. This was one of the main grievances. Many of you know this. In 1804, the Russians once again settled in Sitka and founded New Archangel, or Novoarkhangelsk, the future capital of Russian America. After peace was established between Baranov and the native people of Sitka, we know that a few Tlingit women, not many, but a few did, returned and began living with the Russian people, Russian men, in their new settlement. In general, the number of Indian women living inside New Archangel was pretty small. This was due, according to Andrei, to the complete independence of the Tlingit people and continued tensions in their relations with the Russians. Among the rare exceptions, and here the interesting story begins in my view, the records show that there was a baptized Tlingit woman by the name of Donna Sergeyevna, who married a boatswain, Stepan Likhachov, with whom she had a daughter, Creole Anna, who in turn married a Russian Tlingit Creole man, Dmitry Larionov. So we have two Tlingit Creoles then married. As for Donna Sergeyevna, she had worked for many years as an interpreter for the Russians, and in fact, Captain Lieutenant Leontiy Hagemeister, general manager, who replaced Baranov in 1818, had assigned for her a salary of 60 rubles per year and a small ration from the company for good services. And I think 60 rubles per year is pretty good salary. That's good. Andrei says it's a pretty decent salary for that time. The number of ethnic ties and marriages of the Tlingit with the Russians, the other Europeans, and also represents of Siberian peoples who also served for the company, and Kodiak Alutiks increased significantly after Russian-American company gave permission, or I would say invited, the Sitka people to settle near the walls of New Archangel in 1821. The liaisons of Tlingit women with the Russians made it possible for the Russians to learn sometimes of native intentions, and that, he suggests, saved the lives of Russians when there was maybe some preparation of an attack or something. The Russian administration, the colonial administration of Novoarkhangelsk, had to turn a blind eye to these relations between Russian men and native women, if they existed, because there was such a shortage of females in the Russian colony. Again, there are various forms of relations, from permanent, family-like, to temporary, and there's even evidence in the Russian records that some slave women, in fact, their Tlingit owners benefited from using them as a kind of source of income, where they sort of were sold temporarily to some Russian men. And this is kind of a sensitive topic, and it's not my paper, so I'm not going to talk about it. And he doesn't talk about it, but it's in the record and was worth mentioning. Legal marriages between residents of Novoarkhangelsk and local native women also took place, even though their numbers were small. But when we have the names, I think it's interesting to learn about them. For example, Ivan Molchanov, who worked in the Novoarkhangelsk port as a boatmaster from 1810s to 1830s, officially married a baptized Tlingit lady, Evdokia, with whom he had children, 4 sons and 2 daughters. After Molchanov's death, his widow was sent by the colonial leadership back to her relatives of the Kagwantam clan. This is interesting. To avoid additional costs needed for her support, because as a widow, she had to be supported by the company, and I guess they didn't want to spend the money. But her Creole sons remained among the Russians. One of them, Lev Ivanovich Molchanov, became a sailor on the Russian-American company ships in the second half of the 1820s, and his brother Yemelyan even finished school in Novoarkhangelsk. In 1837, he became a church sexton, then served as a clerk in the Novoarkhangelsk office of the Russian-American company, and in 1841 was sent to serve at the Nushagat mission. In the mid-40s, he returned to Novoarkhangelsk and served the local diocese. He was married there to a Creole woman, Evdokia Maximina Panchina. Andrei doesn't say what her ethnicity was. In 47, he became a sexton and a deacon at St. Michael's Cathedral. Unfortunately, he suffered, like a number of Russians and Creoles in Novoarkhangelsk, from weakness of affection for strong drink, so that kind of undermined his career. But Father Benjamin for St. Innocent observed that in general, Tlingit workers Tlingit or Tlingit Creole, more likely, who worked for the company as sailors, deacons, and in other capacities, generally were sober and diligent and hardworking. To me, who was very interested in these, they're a small group, but still there were Tlingit people in Novoarkhangelsk working for the Russians, with the Russians. I think this is important because usually in the literature, when there's talk of Creoles, you think that they were exclusively Alutik and Onangan or Aleut. But here we have examples of Tlingit or Creole Tlingit participating in the life of the colony. Also, Benyaminov in his notes mentioned that those Tlingit women who did marry Russian men, especially legally through the church, in the church service, remained faithful to their husbands and had very respectable homes. And in fact, and this is of course value judgment, but he says that they seem to be more devoted to their husbands than some of the other women from other ethnic groups. Some Tlingit women, when their husband died, they married another Russian man. A baptized Tlingit woman, Ulyana, mentioned the records, married a Tomsk townsman, city dweller, social strata member, Vasily Zhukov, and bore him 3 children. After his death, remarried another townsman from Petrozavodsk, Ivan Chernogolov, bore him a son, Igor. Occasionally, Tlingit women would marry Creoles or Yakuts. Yakuts are a large indigenous ethnic group from Siberia. They also married representatives of other non-Russian people who lived in Novoarkhangelsk. For example, in 1845, a Kodiak Alutik man, Semyon Kashkar, asked permission, I guess either the church or the authorities of the company, to marry Anna Kakot. So we have occasionally Tlingit names in these records, but the Russian spelling sometimes doesn't give you a good idea what they sounded like. To marry Anna Kakot, whom he called the girl betrothed to him. And in the summer of '53, a Yakut man, Pyotr Burtsev, married a baptized girl named Kaloshenka, which is Tlingit woman, Maria, with whom he then continued his service at the Fort St. Michael in Norton Sound. So you see also how these Tlingit and Tlingit Creole men, women, and their children, they not only lived here, but were kind of spread across those parts of Alaska where the Russians were active. I think I have to kind of wrap things up pretty soon, but I think this gives you some idea of these connections that we didn't know very much about. Andrei mentions 2 interpreters who were Creoles, and since I'm going to talk about Creoles in my paper that follows immediately after this one, I'll mention them. Very interesting men, 2 Tlingit interpreters who had the same last name. These were not Creoles, these are full-blood Tlingit. They had the same name, Gideonov. And I'll have a slide in my presentation with the spelled out name. Interesting example. The reason they had the last name Gideonov is that they were baptized by the famous higher monk Gideon. They were both, we know they were close relatives of high-ranking men, maybe clan leaders, house masters from Yakutat. And they were taken as hostages in a peace ceremony, probably, in Yakutat between the Russians and the native people there, to Kodiak. And some Kodiak that Gideon baptized them. They were baptized, they agreed to be Orthodox, become Orthodox, and studied at the local school. They were young. The older man, upon being baptized, received the name Kalistrat, and the younger one, Niktopolion, Christian name. They both served the Russian-American company as interpreters from Tlingit into Russian and back, and dwelled in Novoarkhangelsk. They both got married, probably to Creole women. Kalistrat's 3 daughters are mentioned in Russian-American company documents as Creole women. And these daughters of Kalistrat then married other Creoles. Andrei mentions their names, but I'll have to skip now. Niktopolion, the other young man, married a Kodiak Alutik woman, Maria, and had several daughters with her, and 1 son. And his son Ivan, so here you already have son of a Tlingit man and a Alutik lady from Kodiak. So this Creole young man sailed for many years, was a sailor on Russian-American ships. First a cabin boy sailor and then a first mate. Pretty interesting career. And all this information, you know, if we had the who is who, we could find some really fascinating stories of these people. But I'll have to. He gives some examples of a few Tlingit women marrying Hudson's Bay Company men in the south of Tlingit country when Denisovsky Redoubt became Hudson Bay Company trading post, fort. And then he also mentions that occasionally there were marriages between Tlingit and Alutiiq, Yupik people, and so forth. And of course, Iyak. The Yakutat married Iyak, so this is northern Tlingit country. And of course, Athabascan, which has been researched by Frederick de Laguna. So in conclusion, and I apologize for cutting some paper because of time, here's Andrei's conclusion. These contacts in the form of inter-ethnic relationship and marriages of the Tlingit with the Russians and other peoples of the Russian Empire who served the Russian-American Company but ethnically were not Russian, as well as with American and British peoples. And I should mention also in his book, there were a few Finns who married Tlingit ladies or Creole Tlingit ladies and Germans. These contacts created complex and sometimes contradictory processes and trends. On the one hand, he says, it stimulated to a significant extent an improvement of relations between Russians and Tlingits, contributed to the prevention of potential conflicts, especially violent ones. On the other hand, they occasionally provoked conflicts as well. You know, especially if the Russian men probably did not behave properly or nobly. Also, these relations stimulated a certain amount of Tlingit acceptance of European culture, at least material culture and Christianity too. With this, the specificity and intensity of interethnic relationships and marriages were determined by various factors, both objective and what he calls subjective and personal in nature. In particular, the perception of members of a different ethnic group, taking into account previous relationships, whether they were peaceful or violent, social status, cultural difference, physical characteristics, and so on. In relationships and marriages of the Tlingit with newcomers, obviously a major sharp gender imbalance existed, since most of the men were Russian or those who came with the Russians, and women were Tlingit. And then with the Iyak, it was in Athabascan, usually the other way around, where Tlingit men married Iyak and Athabascan women. On the whole, matrimonial relations between the subjects of the Russian Empire and the Tlingit led to the growth of a mixed blood, or Creole population, particularly among Native Alaskans living near the walls of New Archangel in this community. It is possible also to distinguish two categories of people of that Creole category. The first was made up of Creoles, real Creoles, who were brought up among their relatives of their mothers. Actually, no, I should backtrack. The first was made of people of this mixed descent, but who were brought up among the relatives of their mothers, so that among the Tlingit people. Therefore, were almost identical culturally from the rest of the Tlingit community. The second category were those who lived in the Russian town, in the Russian settlement, and were brought up by their fathers and the community of their fathers, who spoke Russian and culturally probably were more Russian, and adapted to colonial society. And in my own research, I actually find a few people who I think were kind of in between, really bicultural, and those are the most interesting, but that's me, that's not Andrei. Thus, Russian Tlingit Creole women usually married other Creoles and Russians, while Creole men served as sailors, laborers, master craftsmen, interpreters, and church workers. Unfortunately, not priests, maybe not enough time, Alaska was transferred, but certainly as deacons, sextons, and so forth. Further gradual integration of the Russian Tlingit Creoles, like the Tlingit Indians themselves, into colonial society of Russian America was obviously interrupted by the events of 1867, which we are marking today. It's the sesquicentennial. Now, I edited the paper a little bit, but in the spirit of some of you may be leaving, not able to hear all the papers. We could take a few questions now, with each paper, the resolution, etc., or we can wait till the end of the session. So I don't know what you prefer. Maybe just a couple of questions to each presenter, and then if you have questions or comments on the whole session, then we can do that at the end. So maybe a question or two, I'll translate, and I'm very glad. Yes.
I have a question. Actually, I said in Russian first, and then translate myself. Вот в ваших исследованиях большинство, того, пока не что Сергей прочитал, разговор идет о браках между русскими мужчинами и коренными женщинами. Но ведь, наверное, наверняка были и браки между русскими женщинами и коренными мужчинами. То есть вам совсем не попадалось?
Shane is asking,
because I know from my research that
Shane thinks that there must have been at least some Tlingit men who married Russian women. At least she thinks there must have been.
Таких браков практически не было, потому что просто русских женщин было в 10 раз меньше, чем мужчин. И все женщины были большим дефицитом русских. Вот. Поэтому просто тлингитским мужчинам ничего не доставалось.
Andrei is saying that he doesn't see any records. He doesn't see any records because the ratio of men to women in the Russian colonies was 1 to 10. So he thinks there were no women for the Tlingit men to marry.
There were some exceptions to the case, but I guess I have but the second part of my question is, what do you think about how the culturally children from, say, marriages between Russian men and Tlingit women, given that it kind of disrupted the whole clan relationship of that child, you know, the balance between the different clans. What did they have any exposure to the Tlingit culture, and if they did, how did the culture play?
Ситуация была по-разному. Значит, иногда, я говорю, они стали смотреть, как индийцы, в другом случае становились подданными.
This is an answer from both of us, that actually in the matrilineal society, if the mother is Tlingit, they retain the clanship of the clan membership of the mother. So the disruption is not as dramatic than if the father, if the mother was Russian. And we actually have examples, and I have some in my research, where actually, and if there was a split, a divorce, or just separation, sometimes the kids were taken by the mother back to the village, and they became practically Tlingit, or they lived in town, but still maintained ties with their Tlingit relatives. And I'll talk about one interpreter in my paper who's kind of bicultural. Whether the fact that the father was not a Tlingit at that time, was that a problem, was that a stigma? We don't have enough information. But I think if the father was of high rank, which sometimes happened, but not often, then that would not, they might have been adopting the father in the clan as they do today. It's hard to tell. A lot of these men were probably of the lower ranks. So. And some women kind of left their community. The interesting question would be why they left their community. What was, you know, we don't have enough information. But the matrilineal part was interesting.
Microphone.
Oh, I think we have to move on. Yes, last question, Chuck.
Do you have any information about how many of these women may have been slaves?
Имеется в виду заключил брак.
Да.
Да, нет.
Can establish that. we do know that there were some high-ranking women because, for example, one Kiksadi man whom the Russians really groomed to be the chief of all Tlingit and Sitka, which of course is a dubious title, and they were sort of giving him gifts and raising his rank, but he was a pretty high-ranking man to begin with. His sister married someone in Novarkhansk, so obviously his sister was a pretty high rank. So there was some high ranking. Andrei thinks that we don't have much evidence, but I don't think the majority were slaves. And it's not the case. Okay, thanks a lot. I can also talk to any of us afterwards. Okay, moving along. Okay, since my topic is interpreters, before and after 1867, but before I want to make a couple of observations, and I was thinking about healing, since that was the theme of our conference, has been the theme. And I'm thinking that reconciliation between peoples is also a form of healing. And my sense is, certainly thinking about 2004 ceremony that the Kiksadi people had at the park, the 200th anniversary of the battle, that my sense was, and if I'm wrong, and I apologize to the Kiksadi, who some of them are here, that there wasn't a lot of anger and vengeance. It was remembering those who died, clan members, but also a kind of reconciliation. And I think there was a Russian lady there who at least said that she was related distantly to Baranov. And I think it was important for the clan to have a Russian representative. There was a sense that, yeah, it was a battle, it was bloodshed, but that should be put behind. That kind of, bad history should be put behind us. And we should remember also, we shouldn't forget the nasty things that happened, but we should also think of the good things that happened, like the Russian church that came to Alaska through the Russians. And also the family connections, and in this case I'm going to talk about language. A lot of Native people knew Russian, some still do, or at least know the prayers. Some have Russian last names, some have Russian first names, and I think those things cannot be erased. They cannot be just edited out of Alaska Native history. Yes, the issues of land and sovereignty, and really telling the true story of transfer and the Native people, being kind of left out. Although some of the records I just found suggest that there were Tlingit clan leaders present on what they call Castle Hill. The fact that at least that they were there, what they thought watching that ceremony, I wish I knew, but a few of them were present. That doesn't make it any better, but at least they invited them. Those issues are really fundamental, but it does not negate the fact that the human connections and some of the things that are still with us, they should be looked at as well. So relations range from outright hostility to a lot of trade, to, as we just seen, marriages and having children together, to, and remember the story of the Sitka battle that Dick and Nora finally brought to us, putting together Russian written record and oral tradition from Kiksadi people. The one Russian that the Kiksadi didn't want to kill when they burned down the first fort, Plotnikov. Why didn't they want to kill him? Because he was married to a Tlingit woman. He was a brother-in-law. And the brother-in-law is a very important relative. We know that. You honor him. And he kept coming back and they kept telling him, get out of here, go away. Because you're a relative now and we don't want to kill you even though you're Russian. So here kinship overrides blood. And then I think that's a very important story. And we have descendants of Plotnikov here in Sitka. A family that I'm very close to, the Littlefields and Youngs. So that's what I want to to talk about. So, why interpreters? I think interpreters have had a lot of power, because imagine two people, two groups coming together, they can't communicate. And so the person who knows both languages and translates information, relates information, he or she can change it, kind of twist it a little bit, or translate it in a way that favors one or the other side. Can also translate in a way that his or her own influence would increase. There are all kinds of things an interpreter can do. So they're also witnesses to what's going on. Think of all the treaties, and where you have to interpret honestly, but maybe what you're hearing, if you're a native person, things that are not favorable to your own people, and it's probably heartbreaking. So there are people in between cultures, but there are also people who mediate and connect cultures. So I'm really fascinated with these interpreters. So I want to talk a little bit about some of them. We don't have images and portraits of these first Tlingit interpreters, early ones, but at least we have some. But I want to start with this image of John Simpson Smith. He's not Tlingit at all. I just found him online. Fur trapper, trader, interpreter, recognized spokesman for the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribal nations in the West. Spent most of his life living among these people, married a native woman, I'm not sure Cheyenne or Arapaho. Had a very colorful life, had a child, son, with her. Unfortunately, during one of the massacres, the U.S. Army killed his son. But he definitely was on the side of the native people. He interpreted for them when they went to Washington. And in his life, he met all the major Cheyenne and Arapaho chiefs and several U.S. presidents. I didn't have enough time to look into his life, but I just wanted you to look at him. He is this man. So he's, biologically an American. He's not a mixed blood person, but culturally, I think definitely in between, and especially through his marriage. And being at the heart of these negotiations with the U.S. government for Cheyenne and Arapaho, imagine he had a lot of influence. He's seen a lot. It's really important. And I think there's a whole trend now to try to look into the lives of these people and intimately, not just like see them as tokens. So, in terms of my stories, I'm just mentioning some of the folks that were mentioned in Andrei's paper. So, for example, the first manager of the Yakutat Russian fort, built in 1795, and then a few years later Tlingit destroyed it. The Russian #1 official at that fort, he married a Tlingit woman and had Stepan Fyodorich Larionov killed in 1805 when the Tlingit attacked the fort. So his fate is pretty tragic, sad. But it was a legitimate attack because the Russians didn't behave very well there, and Frederica de Laguna describes that whole story very well. But he had two children, Dmitry and Pelagie. And that's in Andrei's Who is Who, that's where my information mostly comes from. And eventually Dmitry, for a while Dmitry and Pelagie stayed with their mother. So that's Jenny's question. So they definitely learned to speak Tlingit from their mother and her people, acquired kind of Tlingit culture. But I guess, at least Dmitry, I'm not sure about Pelagie, but Dmitry, I guess, was kind of drawn to his father's people as well. Because eventually he left the Yakutat area, and some say ran or sort of escaped from the tribe. But in any case, he ends up in New Archangel. And he serves as an interpreter. So here he's using his skills, and then worked for the company for quite some time. The Gideonovs are fascinating, and I wish there was more information about them. What really struck me, and again, I found information about them in Andrei's book, what struck me about them, that one of them, first of all, we have their Tlingit names, and maybe working with our Tlingit linguists, and at least trying to figure out how these names might have sounded, we could figure out what their clans were. We know they were from Yaktat, and we know they were of high rank. So we have Yaktat clans at least narrowed down, and then figure out which clan might they have been. One of them, I can't remember right now. Problem is I have my paper and I have this PowerPoint, but I can't have both on the screen. So I'm basically just showing you, I think it's important so you can read their names, and I'm just remembering what I wrote in the paper, but that's okay. One of them had a salary paid by the company. He had a servant. They called him Petrushka. I don't know, was it a Russian servant, a Creole servant, or a Tlingit servant, but he had a servant. So they gave him a pretty decent rank within the company. So they must have been good interpreters, respected. So I find that fascinating. Now, the central character of my paper was supposed to be Ivan Zhukov, and that was in the abstracts and in the program, but I kind of diverged a little bit. But I will talk a little bit about Zhukov. He was a Tlingit Creole. There is a Zhukov mentioned in Andrei's paper, so maybe he was a child of Zhukov, a Russian, and a Tlingit lady. It appears that he was raised in New Archangel in this Russian cultural kind of milieu, but he definitely was fluent in Tlingit, so either his mom taught him, or maybe he even spent time in the village, so there was maybe some traffic. He went to a Russian school and attended probably the seminary that Father Innocent established here in the 40s. We know that he was an excellent interpreter. The church records that I've seen, the work on Zhukov I did on my own before Andrei's book came out. He translated, not only interpreted during services or when Russian priests wanted to talk to the Tlingit people or preach, but he translated parts of the gospel, and he received rewards, monetary and papers rewarding him for his work. He taught at the seminary, taught Tlingit language to what the Russian church hoped would be future priests working among Tlingit. Had a really brilliant career ahead of him, but at some point, I think in the early 50s, something happened. The church doesn't even say. Must have been drinking and maybe some situation with a woman, but the records say Ivan committed some very bad deed, and they sent him away to Kodiak, I believe, or a Lutic country. So they kept him within the sort of the church kind of workforce, but they didn't want him to be in New Archangel. They said his behavior sets a bad example for Tlingit people. It's bad. Conversion would stop if he stays here. And there I think he liked the ladies, that was another problem. Because he got involved, he was sent to that area, and one of the local clergymen, and I don't know if he was Creole or Russian, was supposed to supervise him. And what did he do? He had an affair with the man's daughter, and the two of them ran away, and that wasn't cool. But he married the woman, so at least he had the decency to marry the young woman. But his reputation constantly kind of, he's sort of shooting himself in the foot. But the church workers who knew him kept saying, yeah, he's not a perfect man, but he's so good. He's such a good interpreter, and we don't have a lot of them, especially with Tlingit. We're lacking interpreters, and we can't let him go. We really need him. And this went on even after 1867, even more so, because There were fewer clergymen here after transfer and fewer interpreters, and they continued relying on him. But his response was, I'll work for the church, but I'm broke. Creoles suffered a lot after the sale. The Americans were kind of mean to them. They looked down on them. They viewed them as mixed bloods, mongrel race. The category Creole didn't exist in the Yankees' mind. Mixed race was considered in some ways even worse than being native. One American wrote, Sitka has these people who combine the worst characteristics of both races, white and native. So for a while plus they stopped receiving any support from Russian-American companies, so they were lost. Zhukov was smart, and he offered his services to the Americans. So he served as an interpreter for the troops and American officials, and eventually also managed to get a position as one of the native policemen. Most of them were Tlingit. Some of them high rank, like Anahoots, Kailantan chief. But I guess here he managed to, he was Creole, mixed blood, but he served as a policeman and died in 1886 at age 61. And the Alaska newspaper said that buried in the Russian cemetery, Orthodox cemetery, but a whole group of Indian policemen and soldiers, American soldiers, followed his coffin, the procession, and played. Music was played, and he was honorably buried. Very interesting career. The last thing I'll mention, what makes him really interesting to me, he knew Tlingit culture really well. Why do I say that? A few years before he died, he shared a pretty long account of Tlingit customs, especially information on Tlingit religion, memorial ku'i, shamanism, magic, with Lieutenant George Emmons. That account is published in Freddie de Laguna's book on Emmons's records, 91. And it's interesting that even though he was bilingual, Russian, Tlingit, and I think he knew some English, he needed an interpreter, and his interpreter was this very important gentleman, Sergei Kostomitnov, who himself was a Creole, although, again, born before transfer, but lived most of his life here in Sitka after transfer. And because he was well-to-do, he was a businessman, territorial guard officer, and at the end of his life actually became a Russian priest. He's buried near the cathedral. He was very rarely would anyone mention that his mother was actually Creole, and his father was Russian, manager for the Russian-American company. He was always referred to as a Russian gentleman, a Russian-American. So it's interesting how class, if you had money and you had stature in Sitka in the late 19th century, then your Creole ancestry was kind of overlooked, and the local American establishment treated you as a white man. But he was a very interesting person, and I've written about him, so I'm not going to spend time. But he also worked as an interpreter for the Americans, traveled all over Alaska. I think he knew Tlingit, Alutiiq, possibly some Onanga. He was an amazing person. His English was very good, and of course Russian. He went to Russian school as a kid. So here's Zhukov talking to Emmons, talking about Tlingit culture in Tlingit, and there are a lot of Tlingit words in his account. For some reason, he didn't want to talk in Russian. Maybe English wasn't so good. And another Creole, so as a Tlingit Creole talking about Tlingit culture in Russian, and Alutiiq, his mom was Alutiiq, Kostomitnov translating his account into English. And what I was really interested in, I'm looking at Zhukov's account, and in a few places he says, these people, they're smart, so Tlingit are they. So that would seem like he's identifying with the Russians. But then he says our, so he's like, who are you? Are you Tlingit? Are you Russian? It feels like he's respecting them, but still it's sort of ambivalent. he's kind of in between. But there's some very interesting information in his account. So I picked this picture, partly just was the first thing that popped up on the internet, but I love this picture because George Hammond is also a fascinating guy, and he's holding Louis Shotridge as a little boy. And I know we're going to hear about Louis Shotridge from Lucy Williams, so looking forward to that. And then my last, no, I have two more, and then I'll stop, promise. Harlampi Sokolov, this is post-transfer definitely, although he was born before. Another Creole, probably, father was a deacon in the Russian church before transfer. I don't know if his mother was a Lutik or Aliyev, probably a Lutik. He was quite a character. He worked for the church. I think he studied at the seminary. He's right here. And then he's here. So he was a teenager when Alaska became American. And again, he was very good. He was not a Tlingit Creole, that's for sure. But in the Russian church records, it says Harlampi speaks fluent Tlingit, but his reputation is kind of strange. He's participated in Tlingit dances and ceremonies, even in a cremation. So there's still a few Tlingit who were, instead of burying, or cremating, which is traditional. If he did that, he must have had really close friends. Maybe he was even adopted. And later on, when he lived in Angun and Kilsnu, and still worked for the church, but his grievance was after the transfer that the church couldn't pay him a living wage, so he was doing other things. This is Father Sobolev, Bishop Pustinsky, 1905. He visited these noble gentlemen. They're all Angun, Kutsnu, land leaders, and so forth. This is in my book on the Sobolev pictures. But here, he's sitting with, this is my favorite picture, he's sitting next to Kichnad, the Steen House, Steel House headman, leader, in Angun, or maybe Kilsnu. And this man lent him a very important shirt. And that shirt's still in existence, and Harold says that the clan still owns it. And I don't think he would lend him this if it was just a casual, this is serious stuff. So they were either friends, or that he was adopted. It's kind of silly because he's also holding a pistol. But in any case, Father Sobolev writes in his diary that Harlampi invites Tlingit to his house for tea, or sometimes some hard drink. And he criticizes the church because he has some grudge against me, and I still have to rely on him because he's a very good interpreter, but this guy is trouble. But I'm just fascinated by this Russian Creole who fluent in Tlingit, goes to Tlingit ceremonies, you know. And then my last example is back to Sitka, and those of you who born and raised in Sitka know Paul Liberty. And of course we all know Paul Liberty is one of the founders of A&B, but he was also, and we know, an absolutely brilliant interpreter. He was raised, born Tlingit, he was Piksadi, Anyana was his Tlingit name. But for some reason he ends up at the, sometimes called orphanage, but we call now Bishop's house, as a boy. His name is in the records there. And the Russians gave him the name Baranov. And I don't know why, Baranov is an important name. But I thought maybe Anyanov sounds like Baranov. But he learned Russian there. I think he not only went through their elementary school, but I think had some education at their seminary, which they reopened in the 1900s. So he was fluent in Russian, of course, English, and Tlingit, so trilingual. And he worked for the church. He became a deacon. And this is a wonderful picture of him as a young man, around 1910. I'm not sure who the priest was. In the Alaska Historical Library records, the photography records, he's not identified. It just says a deacon and a priest, so we've got to change that. And last thing I'll say, again, he wasn't paid enough money. The church was very poor then, so he had to have other jobs. And one of his jobs, 1920, was he was taking part of the census of the village. and he contracted pneumonia and died as a young man. It was a huge loss. I interviewed his daughter, Helen Howard, many years ago, so she told me a lot about him. They say that when he interpreted the priest's sermons, he could not only interpret Russian into Tlingit, and a lot of these priests, up to 1917, they still couldn't speak any English because they came from Russia. He could imitate the voice, the pitch, the cadence. He could speak like that man. And the Russian church was just amazed by him. And of course, he also is well known by composing the tune for that famous song, Glory to God in the Highest. So I want to end with Paul Liberty and just the importance of language that conveys political messages, but also spiritual, and connects people. I think that's kind of my story. I'm sorry it took long, but I wanted to bring human face to sort of put a human face on it. Take maybe one question, and then I'd be happy to answer them in the break because I want to give my colleagues time. Okay, if there are no questions, we're going to move on to yeah.
Okay, hello. It's very good to be here. I'm grateful for being invited here. Very honored today. Everyone who participated in getting me over here. It's really fun to talk about this. I work on other things now, but I go back to the Alaska themes once in a while. So I want to focus. I will jump around a little bit in my talk, and it's not really a paper, but more of a talk. And the basic idea that I want to present to you is that we're not, sometimes we talk about Russians as if they were this one group. But I want to say that there were very different people who came among those Russians, who came here, and because of where we come from, often shapes the way we see people we meet. They saw those people in very different ways, depending on the path they took to Tlingit America, to this area which they found themselves in after, let's say, 1804. Okay, so this is a path of the first round-the-world voyage that was, I think, a very important event in Russian imperial history that happened between 1803 and 1806. And of course, in 1804, one of the ships from that round-the-world voyage came over here, Kodiak and Sitka. It also happens to be the time when you have the Battle of Sitka, the Second Battle of Sitka, when this area was taken back by the Russians, with the participation of the Russian Navy. And eventually, Russian Navy became, after Baranov, who was a merchant with whom the government was never comfortable, was replaced. All the so-called governors or administrators of this area were Russian naval officers, or I should say, officers of the Russian Imperial or Romanov Empire Imperial Navy. Anyway, so what I want to say is that these officers came with a certain culture and a certain education and had a very different frame of reference than the, let's say, Siberianized Russians who had crossed Siberia. So just think about this path of getting to Alaska and getting just first, because in order to get to Alaska, right, from St. Petersburg to Moscow, you have to cross all of Eurasia, all of first Europe and then Asia, from the European part of Russia. This is 3 times the size of the Lewis and Clark journey. So as you can imagine, like for example, when Bering came here, he took more than 2.5 years to cross with this party this territory. And as you can imagine, as you cross this vast territory, you meet all kinds of people along the way. And you interact and see many different people, many of whom are, culturally very different from the Europeanized Russians. And of course, they meet other Russians, but they also meet the local people. So first you have the Tatars, and then some other peoples, and eventually you get to Kamchatka and Kamchadals. So all of that leaves a trace. And I remember reading diaries of Russian priests who were going across. And even by the time they got to the end of their trip just across Eurasia, it's like they went to college on Russian ethnography, right? So they knew much more than they did before, just from feeling and seeing people. So what I want to say is that what's interesting is that the Siberianized Russians, many of whom had, by this time, because there were very few Russian women in Siberia, they had Siberian grandmothers, indigenous Siberian grandmothers, Siberian mothers. So Siberianized Russians who ended up in Alaska were culturally quite very different from the people who would come on around-the-world voyages directly from St. Petersburg these voyages, initial voyages were extremely important. It was very prestigious to be on there. They kept, both of the ships had large libraries in many languages. They knew about Cook, they knew about La Perouse, they knew about all the other previous discoveries around the world. And they were comparing notes with other European discoverers as they were traveling around. So they came with a very different frame of reference. And you can see this in the traces because, for example, when the Russians who came from Siberia talk about Aleuts, or Unangan Aleuts they met in Kodiak, they always compare them to Kamchadals and to Yakuts, and they say, oh, they look kind of like Yak. That's why they often thought of, for example, the Inuit and the Aleuts as very different from, for example, the Tlingit, because they saw physically that they look different, and they could perceive also a different culture, and they compared them to the Asian native Siberians of Asia. Whereas if you're coming from around the world, you're coming, let's say, before you get here, you are in South America, and you're comparing then Russian colonialism to Portuguese colonialism in Brazil, in California, comparing California to Alaska. And this is when, for example, the word Creole enters the vocabulary after the first round of the voyage. Before that, you don't have that term, because in Siberia, if you're born from a Russian father and a native Siberian mother, you're Russian, if you're baptized. There's none of that category of being a Creole, but here it becomes a different estate, eventually a different identity. Anyway, so that's why I think it's very important how you get there to how you see people. And I think also because these round-the-world voyages brought people who were in much greater contact with sort of European culture in general, they were imbibing many of the sort of common stereotypes that shared by other Europeans. They were talking to them all the time and all of that. Okay, so with different Russians, you get different representations or images of native Alaskans. Just to give you an idea, so not only do you cross this, does it take such a long time to cross first the Siberian tract and then up to like Baikal, down the river, across very large mountains. Not only does it take so long, but then you have to then of course sail from there. And in the Russians of course went across the Aleutian Islands. They didn't, so they go across the Aleutian Islands Sea. It's another illustration of that. Okay. So, so the round-the-world voyage effect, as I would call it, of course produced, first of all, there was that moment of the Battle of Sitka, which is of course incredibly important in Alaskan history, and changed Russian focus from being at Kodiak to being here. They built their new capital, New Archangel, but also then you have the introduction of this whole new category, and eventually you had, even during the Battle of Sitka, if you read Lyshansky's book, he claims that he was the one, for example, who came up with the name New Archangel, that he superseded Baranov in actually running that battle, because he was a military officer of the Russian Imperial Navy. And this was kind of a prelude to the fact that the Navy would later take over Alaska, I think, in some ways. Here's Yuri Vishansky, Fyodor Kruzhenstern, who was at that time sailing on the Asian coast and trying to open up, force Japan to trade with Russia, also force China to trade with Russia. Didn't work very well. But so in some ways I view this period, so 1804, as kind of a stepping stone from where you have what for Russians was the farthest frontier of Siberia, to becoming kind of Russia's overseas colony on the model of overseas colonies of other European imperial colonies. And as they did so, you also had a very changing attitude toward the natives that happened along with the same process. Okay, so this of course is one of the images. I have a black and white image, but it's actually easier to see some things. This is a beautiful painting by Mikhail Tikhonov, who was a painter on one of these voyages, and there were many more, almost on a yearly basis after 1806. There were all these voyages. And of course, Kotlyan is a very famous Tlingit, sitting presumably with his wives, and Sitka of the Archangel in the background. So what's interesting is that Tikhonov and some other of these artists, they were on the ship along with, for example, botanists who studied plants and other scientists who were there studying scientifically and exploring the world. And they were there these were considered to be, and they were, voyages of discovery from the Russian point of view. And so they had this very kind of scientific flavor to them. And this was part of his job then to do this. Okay. But I just want to go briefly over some of these images of how they painted. And one thing I want to mention, for example, this is a California native boy. And also, I think Tikhonov painting. But what's interesting to me is that I remember translating for somebody who did the art presentation many years ago in California about this particular painting and Tikhonov and some other Russian painters, but to show how much even these painters that are supposed to paint what they see, and they're supposed to be almost like photographing, but of course photographs also are a form of art. How they, in some ways, that people in the audience in California seem to think, hey, these Russians, they paint people differently than what, for example, American painters of the West do, paint natives. In some ways, they feature somehow these boys look a little bit Russian, maybe, even though they're native. So it's interesting how that plays out. And again, it kind of goes to show you that the expectations that you bring with you, whatever route you take, shape the way you see sometimes the people that you meet when you get there. Okay, so this is another image of California outside of Fort Ross. By the way, Zhenya, I think, who gave a wonderful talk yesterday, has a great site on Visioning Alaska, which has a lot more paintings, many more paintings that are in far better quality than the power slides I have here. But it's a real treasure trove to see these artistic reflections. I want to pause a little bit on this painting by a man. Sometimes he goes. There's a controversy about how exactly to say his names. Yes, originally Ludwig was his name. Comes from a German background inside the Russian Empire. But he was published in France and went by Louis. And Horace is the way that he pronounced apparently his last name. But what's interesting about this image is this is supposed to be Horace's image on one of the round-the-world voyages of the inhabitants of the Aleutians in this case. But notice the difference between the man and the woman here in this painting. And the influence is also, because we're talking so much, we're developing this kind of a sub-theme of woman-man intimate relations. Think about how the woman is dressed, and she's of course wearing a cross, and she's wearing clearly clothing that does not come from the Aleutian Islands. And so there's a kind of a, and of course many of these, some of them at least ended up with a Russian man, Creole man, realized. But anyway, and then the man has a very traditional look, at least in this, with perhaps some other artistic license that the artists apply. But it's kind of striking that difference in what is supposed to be, you know, it shows you also the Russian gaze, as they put it, like how they saw the woman and the man. Okay, so just a few other random pictures of these round-the-world voyages, just to give you an idea of how they were documented. Again, Tikhonov in Hawaiian, the Hawaiian Islands, finally. Okay, so basically, so I think what I want to try to say is that perspective matters, right? This is kind of like my world, I guess, painted in a different way. What things that present, you know, the famous pictures of like the view from New York, right, or the view from Sitka, or even you know, Sarah Palin's New Yorker cover when she looks at Russia is close to my house. So yes. But I guess what I want to say is that, again, for the Russians, I think, I want to now focus a little bit on how they saw the Tlingit specifically. I think the main thing about the Tlingit, the major thing about the Tlingit, from the point of view of the Russian naval officers who were here running this territory, was that they were independent. They were not dependent. So I think in the Russian-American company records, there's a very strong definition of dependent native, зависимый, и независимые туземцы. And they were independent, and that made them different, for example, from the Unangan and the Aleutic who had to work for the Russians. And with that came both, of course, I don't want to dwell on the fact that, of course, they had some conflicts and they politically viewed it as particularly fierce and all this. That goes, you know that. But I think it also shows that they had a great deal of respect for the Tlingit. The Tlingit were seen, and it comes across in a lot of the documents, as very shrewd traders, both in terms of trading with both the English and the Russian intermediates, but also playing off the English against the Russians when they needed to, and things like this. And of course there were also a lot of other, just like there were, I'm suggesting there was a lot of conflict between Siberianized Russians and Europeanized Russians. So there were big differences among the Tlingit, the Stichian and Sitka and all this. And this was all recorded. But basically what the officers were trying to do, and in the 1840s they came the closest, was they had this whole, in the Russian American company reports that I was just rereading last night, they were talking about all the time. They had this whole category in the 1840s that they had to report on measures taken to pacify the independent natives, bring them closer to Russians. And a lot of it had to do with trade. They were trying to use trade with Russia as a kind of a bait to co-opt the natives, the independent natives, to make them more dependent on Russian products, Russian goods, as that. So, and I think, so what I would argue is that by the 1840s, there were this naval rule of let's say, collectively, Russia's colonies of America on Tlingit land stabilized more or less, and they achieved a lot of their goals. And they had, at that point, all these trade fairs that they ran for the Tlingit outside of New Archangel, with the purpose of getting the Tlingit to deliver provisions, also because the Russians were always in need of provisions and food, but also to trade furs and to win them over. And they began to hire Tlingit. And one of them in Novarkhangelsk, in New Archangel, in the port and on ships, And the goal was not only to replace the Aleuts, or the Alutic and the Nangan, who were seen by the Russians as better at hunting rather than being here, but also to replace the Russians eventually. So there was this aspiration. This later would come to a halt in the 1850s, and after that, the decision shortly after that would be to sell Alaska because it didn't work out. But I think to the Russians, to the Russian Navy, at a certain point, the Tlingit-Russian relations were quite important because they knew, partly because there were so few Russians here, that they needed peace in order to just stay here. They wanted, of course, to exploit the resources for their own use. And they knew that they wanted to win over the sympathies. Okay, so and this is also part of the period, you might know, in 1838, there was this treaty between the Hudson's Bay Company, which of course was the neighbor, and the Russian-American Company, at the expense of the Tlingit, because they were both trying to sell to the Tlingit. They were competing with each other right before that, but instead they now cooperated in order to assure that neither company is threatened. And even during the Crimean War in the 1850s, there's a secret treaty that excluded this Alaska and British Columbia from any kind of warfare as a result. Anyway, but it's to finish up. So the experiment then in 1842 of hiring Tlingit men as sailors on Russian-American vessels was seen as a great success, according to the company, throughout the 1840s. It was just an experiment. They were trying to see how, but the Tlingit men were seen as being good workers, and more importantly, for the point of view of the company, which is the business, they cost less, and they didn't have to be brought from Eurasia than the Russian men, and the Aleuts could be doing other things. And also, as mentioned, for example, they created this. They tried to create a new hierarchy for the Tlingit society by choosing one toyon, one person, the main Kolosh or Tlingit toyon, whose name is Mikhail Kukhan in Russian, he's Russian, in 1842, and giving him more and more money to make him seem more prestigious to other Tlingit. That didn't work too well, but I think it was part of the Russian strategy that they used throughout the empire to co-opt the elites of various societies in order to use those elites to rule over everybody else. Okay, so I guess, so my main point is, this is to cover my book, but just to go back to this point, is that perspective matters. It really matters where you come from, for how you see people, and it really shapes. So in many ways, for the Russians, all the whatever the positive or negative portrayals of Tlingit and other Alaska natives, they were mirrors of their own insecurities that they carried with them, as well as their own fantasies. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilya. Before I turn this over to our least but not last, Andrei Znamensky. Andrei Grinyov reminded me that I kind of gave short shrift to Tlingit women interpreters, and I really should have said more about them, but that was the problem with not having a split screen, because my paper has a number of Tlingit women, so we should remember them as well. But now I turn it over to Andrei Znamensky, who will talk about Alaska in contemporary Russian nationalist thought.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Thank you to everybody for remaining to the very end. I I'm going to talk about what Sergei in his introduction called Russian fiction and non-fiction, pulp fiction. Literature that has been published in Russia for the past 15 years that tells us something about Alaska. And this something is the desire to present the history of Alaska from so-called Russian viewpoint. Okay. Since I don't have too much time, I'm going to hammer in your minds my major thesis, and in order to bring up my major thesis, let me briefly tell you about one of the books which I'm going to analyze. So here's the novel by a certain Michael Zuev. The title is Last Year, published in 1961. The plot is very simple, but brace yourself, it's very bizarre. The major character is one Andrei Gagarin, who is betrayed by his fiancée. He escapes to Russian America, Alaska. It's the 1840s. He goes to live with the local Athabascan tribe. According to the rules of the genre, romantic genre, he becomes the chief of this so-called tribe, teaches them agriculture, teaches them craft skills, and in 1868 he goes to Sitka. And since he was cut off from the rest of the world, he wasn't aware that Alaska was ceded, sold to the United States. So his heart, his soul is boiling, he is angry. He is angry about that the piece of his motherland was sold to the United States. So he buys guns from local smugglers, goes back to Central Alaska, South Central Alaska, to his tribe, arms them, and begins the guerrilla fight against the American presence. And in fact, the last pages of this novel, they end with this confrontation. The bluecoats come to a fortress he built with this Athabascan group, and they fight against each other. So we don't know about the results of this conflict, but that's the end of this novel. What I'm interested in here is not so much in this bizarre plot, but the book itself. Okay, the book takes us to the world of people who are writing this book. The book, by the way, went through 5 editions, and I mentioned this. The most recent one was published in 2006. And let me quote for you one of the readers, okay, which I copied from the website, reviews of this book. One of the people who love this book. I quote, "When you read this book, you want to cry. So brilliantly does the author show the Russian tragedy, the senseless, foolish, and cunning sale of Russian America, our richest territory. All Alaska is covered with bones of Russian people and poured with rivers of their blood and sweat. It was only this great reformer, liberal, Alexander II, reference to the Tsar, who was capable of making such a stupid decision to sell Alaska. Especially at the time when oil, gold, and coal deposits had been already discovered there." Which is not true, of course, you know. They were not discovered there at that time. Read this book, and you will see how one feels when this land with great graves of ancestors is given away to aliens without any fight, and when he is forced to drop everything and leave, unquote. So here is the literature I'm going to talk about. And this type of literature increased during the last year, during last year and this year, the year of this anniversary of when Alaska was ceded. I'm talking here about fictional and non-fictional books, and also about media articles which advertise this image as Alaska's our land, quote unquote. If you Google Alaska, our Alaska, Russian America, you will see a bunch of these images, hundreds of pictures. Okay, I just yesterday, I copied this and put it here. By the way, it's the 6th time when I'm making this presentation. The first time I did this talk in 2008 at the annual convention of the Alaska Historical Association. And since that time, I did the same presentation. And each time is different, because each year I find the new information. And now I have so much information about this pulp fiction, so soon I might have a small book about 180 pages. If you go to Russian media, you will see a bunch of articles that lament the sale of Alaska to the United States. Here's titles, screenshots. In Russian, I can translate some of them. For instance, this one says, how we sold Alaska, and subtitle, everything can be returned. Okay. The most stunning example of this nationalistic nostalgia about Alaska, about the empire that was lost, happened in 2015, a year when Crimean Peninsula was taken over by Russia. And to celebrate this event and also to make a hint at something else, a sign, a brick sign was erected in the Crimean Peninsula that says, see, the inscription says, the future generation, addressing the future generation. We return Crimea, you are to return Alaska. Again, I don't want to spook you that all Russians think this way, but there is a significant number of people who think this way, okay? Who consume this literature, this fiction and non-fiction, which is widely sold in airport book kiosks, okay, railway stations. A lot of these books about our Alaska sold in popular print. Why do we have this Alaska rhetoric in Russia? First, of course, there is a lot of symbolism. Russian nationalism talks a lot about North, the significance of North. Present-day Russian nationalists, they want to present themselves as descendants of Vikings. There's a lot of things here. But the most probable explanation is that Alaska provides a good opportunity to Russian nationalists or patriots to play the games, rhetoric games, to instigate people's sentiments, to mobilize people. Why Alaska? Because anti-American feelings in the present day Russians. Alaska was not simply a land sold to a foreign nation. This piece of land was ceded to the United States, which is viewed by the present-day Russian nationalists as the cosmopolitan den of evil, the motherland of cosmopolitanism, materialism, money-making, the nation of shopkeepers, England and the United States, in the Russian patriot imagination. These are the most evil nations. Okay. I'm going to sample two myths. There's mythology about mythology about Russian presence in Alaska. The myth number one. There were bad Western colonizers, especially England and the United States. And there were good discoverers and explorers, or Russian progressive colonization. So myth number one. When did it happen? When did this myth came to populate the minds of Russians? When it entered the Russian literature? During the Cold War, in the 1840s, in 1940s, 1950s, when Russia tried to eradicate the Western cultural elements from the Soviet Union. They tried to show that everything that is Russian was good, okay, the best, and that's when this mythology was created about the Russian progressive colonization and the bad Western colonization. At first, they started talking about progressive colonization, but by the end of 1950s, Russian literature, historical literature, and fiction, non-fiction, they already were talking about domestication. So they didn't use the word colonization as applied to Siberia and Alaska. What they used was the word domestication. Okay. Two books were pivotal in this case. The first one by Sergei Markov, Russians in Alaska, 1946. And by the way, the print run, 1 million copies. It's very important. The books are very, they shape people's lives. The second one, Ivan Krat, Baranov's Island, about this area. Okay. So these two books, they talked about domestication, they talked about progressive colonization, and that's how many Russians came to view the history of Alaska. Again, don't forget that these books, they went through many print runs. Okay? They shaped the minds of the people. The major characters in these fictional books are empire builders. Baranov, Ryazanov, Shelikov, the founder of Russian-American company. Good Germans, by the way, good Germans, since a lot of Baltic Germans and Germans were navigators who served the empire. Germans were the elite, Baltic Germans were the elite, among the elite of the Russian Empire. So they are celebrated as good imperial empire builders. Okay. The bad guys, Poles, traitors, always, if you look at the characters, traitors, Poles, they screw up things. Okay. Evil, unscrupulous Englishmen and Americans. Frequently they're called pirates. Henry Barber, William Cunningham, and their prototypes. Always pirates. Okay. And finally, passive natives. So natives normally shown as people who are instigated by somebody against the Russians. Okay. So natives in this literature are presented as people who don't have any initiative. They're always instigated by somebody else to revolt against good Russians. For example, here you can see a picture from a Russian novel called The Keys to the Enchanted Castle, okay, by Alexander Badinin. Okay. It's a biography of Baranov, Keys to Enchanted Castle. It's a symbol. So he found the keys to this great castle called Alaska. Okay. Here you can see the scene of a fight between Russian mighty man and Tlingit. Okay. Of course, the Russians are presented as cultural heroes, as mighty warriors. You can see the image. I purposely picked out this image to show how they try to kind of promote the stereotype. Tlingit, in this novel and in other books which I mentioned before, presented as people who are instigated by the English and Americans, who are sold the whiskey and guns, and they are asked to fight against the Russians. So English pirates, quote-unquote American pirates, they kind of try to backstab Russians and use Indians, okay, against the Russians. This man, this person whose picture you saw, and now I have more colorful pictures. I can't see color picture of Katlian. Okay. Katlian is the favorite evil Indian in this literature, always presented as a quote-unquote evil villain. In this particular novel, which I mentioned, The Keys to the Enchanted Castle, Katlian even asked by Henry Barber to take an oath of allegiance. What kind of oath of allegiance? That I, Katlian, promise to fight against Russians. So, and then he puts a cross like a signature. So bizarre, you know, so. But the stereotype is here that it was English and the Americans who always instigated the Native Americans. So there's no talk about native agency here. So they're like many kings. Myth number two. Myth number two, it's idea that Russian America, quote unquote, was all explored, populated, and closely linked to the motherland. Okay? So you have to understand that in the present day mind of Russian nationalists, Russian is understood not only as Russia proper, okay, ethnic Russia. It's always the lands that were, quote unquote, discovered by the Russians, or where lands are traded by Russians, like Hawaiian Islands, okay, California Fortress, of course Alaska, okay, remote areas of Siberia, whatever they penetrated, it's ours, okay. And here you can see the cover of one of these books with the Russian flag stated right in the heart of Belarus. Most of you are very knowledgeable about Alaskan history. Yesterday, I inserted this map for your perusal. Look at this map. Do you see something strange about this map? The answer to the Russian nationalists. What strikes you about this map, by the way? Anybody? I'm just looking for a feedback. Something strikes you? Did you find something strange about this map? It was printed in 1826. Anybody? Huh? Yes, exactly. Yeah, you got it. First thing, look at this map. You see here churches. We never lived here. Okay? So you got it right. So the point here is that 90% of this area was never explored. Okay, and by the way, by the 1860s, this map looked pretty much the same. Okay, despite Zagoskin's travels through Yukon River. And of course, Chukchi, who lived right across the Bering Strait, are mentioned as native residents of Alaska. So there was no awareness of people who lived in inland areas, or at least there was a weak awareness of people who lived in inland Alaska. Okay. So the area was populated only in coastal areas, so everybody knows about it. And this map is the good illustration of this Russian map. Okay. Tomorrow I will show it again when we have this panel of the sale of Alaska. As an example of this fact that Russian America was never owned by Russia, was hardly explored only in coastal areas, is this example. Fort Yukon, that was erected by the Hudson Bay Company right in the heart of Russian America in 1847. And the English merchants conducted here a lucrative trade with local Athabascans. And the Russians were not aware of this for many years. Okay? Most natives in inland areas, not most, all of them in inland areas, they were not aware that they were part of the empire. Okay? To finish my presentation, and here I invite you tomorrow for this panel where we're going to talk about Alaska accession in 1867. There are two stereotypes about Russian America sale to the United States. The first, Russian nationalists believed that Alaska was sold because of corruption of the Russian Tsar. That the Russian Tsar and his court, they were bribed by the Americans. Although in reality it was the opposite. So Russians had to pay bribes to U.S. Congress people, you know, that kind of forced them to buy this nice. Okay? And myth number two, why Alaska was ceded to the United States, it's a conspiracy theory that Alaska was sold because there was a secret plot against Russia, orchestrated by Freemasons, Americans, who took over this land in order to screw up Russian Empire geopolitically. Okay. So that's the end of the story. Thank you for your attention.
I just would add that it all sounds like a bunch of nuts, but there are people in the Russian parliament who believe this. It is 11:15. I think there's another session, but we could take one or two questions. Yes, Kathy.
Are these books translated into English? Are those books translated into English?
One of them is translated, so come over and I will give you the title.
My favorite was the first book, where there was a native woman, right? With the feather headdress. So their image of native people is bizarre, to say the least.
Any other questions? Yes.
I'd like to just make a quick statement, if I may. Sure. Takwasa Korea kay ya Yucatan kwasay ke ya anushi hasushkasni ke ay ita sa aji sa wati kaya atu metu na ya Tlingit khasati wushke Yucatan at ke takwasa ya kay It's always good that I'm one of the last house leader from the SOK house at the time. We had a clan house here in Sitka at the time. And there are many stories that still untold on behalf of our Tlingit people. That is why I advocate clans visibility. Unfortunately, a lot of our clans have been missing segments of our stories. I just want to make a quick comment. You know, the discovery issue. Many of the explorers commented and said, we never harvest, or we didn't see any visibility of the Tlingit people on the coast of Alaska. But the truth comes out though. I've been speaking with a lot of the clans along the coast, and they actually said, of course they didn't see us, we saw them. So that kind of puts a lot of dimension of our Tlingit people's visibility. And there are a lot of books to be authored by people that have come across with the Tlingit speakers. But a lot of them have not been documented from the Tlingit perspective, in association of goodwill. An example, what led up to infraction of the Battle of Kasyan and the Russians. I make this comment positively in lieu of interpretation by Nora and Richard Donauer on the Battle of Katlian, as we know in English, but its true name as a quick study was Kasyan. And so I want to just make the quick comment that when the Kiksati were interviewing some of the negative things that were actually happening with the fort that the Russians had here. So Kasyan actually interviewed people that were sharpshooters. And mainly because the Kiksati clan didn't like what was happening, because the Tlingits were being contracted to provide food and such, like deer, a lot of the edible foods along the coast, like hare eggs, gumboots, clams, and such. And so most of the Tlingits agreed because they were being paid for gathering our subsistence food. And these comments, of course, I'm making this in lieu of now that we're actually making the Russian government visible, and we enjoy listening to Sergei and his visibility with our Tlingit people. And the people that made it happen with Nora and Richard Downhauer, and also Matthew Fred, and some of these leaders. So, as a Dakota town, our clan stories, comments, quips are still alive for those that are Tlingit speakers, and we understand. So, I know a comment that George Bennett. George, can you stand up, please? George is one of the Tlingit speakers. And so I comment and make him visible because he knows some of these stories. And he had a good teacher. And thank you, George. But there are few Tlingit speakers left. And it would be wonderful if we had dialogue with some of this Russian history that are here. And some of them could be in agreement and supportive of where we're at today. And so I'm so glad to be here and to listen to Sergei and the comments. And so I wanted to just make a comment about that. Thank you very much.
Just want to mention one thing, and then we'll definitely take a break. When I started my research in '79, and I would identify myself as having been born in Russia, and at that time I was a very recent immigrant, and pretty much 9 out of 10, or even more so, times, the people here in Sitka were really happy to hear that. I remember old man Charlie Joseph Kazlat, he would say, "Oh, Anushi." And I had that feeling that for him, the fact that I was Russian, not American, was a good thing. And he would tease me and say, "Yeah, we used to fight with you." Or he would say, "Your people, you build that fort." But it was in joking kind of manner. So in his mind, and a lot of other elders, there was like white people, Americans, and then there were the Anushi. Old enemies, but also people we've been involved with for so long. And then, of course, a lot of Russian, quite a few Russian words entered Tlingit language. So some of the old-timers would say, "Sadis," sit down. Or, "Would you like some chayu?" "Would you like some tea?" So they knew those words. They still remembered them. So actually, I think the fact that I was Russian-born helped the work when I started it. So on that note, I think we should take a break. But thank you for being here.